All right, so this lecture is going to be for chapter 22. We're going to be talking about metabolism and energy balance. And if you look at anybody in America, we obviously don't understand as much about this as we would like because a lot of individuals are overweight. So we're going to go through what we do understand, particularly with the neuroendocrine control of body weight. So we'll see that it's a complex interaction between the brain and the GI tract, as well as even the storage depot, which we'll see is going to be the fat tissue. So what's the major source of energy storage is obviously going to be the subcutaneous fat, particularly if you're healthy. If you're unhealthy, as we saw, visceral fat is going to be one of the issues, and that is going to cause the obvious increase in body mass index as well as your waist circumference. And typically, normal waist circumference should be, for a male, less than 40 inches, and for a female, less than 35 inches. And where you measure it is typically right around your belly button and go all the way back. So we're going to look at the nutrients, and obviously you have protein, carbohydrate, as well as fats, the different hormones that help regulate the process. So we've talked about cholecystokinin in the GI tract. You also have insulin. We'll see there are other hormones like leptin as well. In particular, they're hormones secreted by the GI tract as well as in the hypothalamus, particularly peptide YY and others. And we'll see how those hormones feed back on the hypothalamus to either stimulate or inhibit the satiety centers. So one of the amazing facts is that over the course of years and years, the human body is able to regulate energy intake as well as the exercise and your metabolic activity to maintain a relatively stable weight. And when you look at the amount of calories and input going in and the output that you're expending that energy on, it's really a phenomenal system of regulation that we are able to maintain that weight balance within a specified range. And if you look at how your metabolism changes, particularly as you age, so as you get older, typically your metabolic rate is going to decrease. And from the time that you're typically around 25 to the time you're 45 or 50, the average individual is going to gain approximately 25 to 30 pounds. And certain people gain much more, as you've seen, and go on to become morbidly obese. So diet plays a role on this, as obviously exercise does, but hormones really play a key part in that, and also how your diet affects the hormones that are released. And we'll see in particular carbohydrates. As you ingest carbohydrates, that tends to increase your blood sugar. And the rate at which your blood sugar increases is going to affect how much insulin you release. And insulin, in this chapter, we're going to see is an anabolic hormone. So it stimulates the deposition of carbohydrates, particularly in the liver. You build glycogen. You also are going to be able to store fat, and you build proteins. And we saw the liver makes a lot of different proteins because it gets a lot of those raw materials from the GI tract, so it's very easy to then make the necessary proteins that the body needs. So looking at all the different hormones, we see corticotropin releasing hormone, which helps to control cortisol. You remember that when individuals who have high levels of cortisol, they get obese, so you get the abdominal obesity. You also get the moon face that occurs. Neuropeptide Y is a hormone that helps to regulate the hypothalamus. So insulin and peptide YY is a hormone produced in the GI tract. Typically, when they tell you to wait before you get seconds when you're going back to the try to eat, it's really because they're waiting for food to make its way through the GI tract, and you start producing that peptide YY, which then goes and tells and interacts with the hypothalamus to stimulate the satiety center. Ghrelin, on the other hand, is a hormone produced by the stomach, particularly when you're devoid of energy reserves, so it makes you hungry. Cholecystokinin we talked about, so the hypothalamus helps to regulate all of this complex endocrine control. And they've even seen that individuals who've had accidents where they get damage to the head and it interferes with the hypothalamic function. For instance, a 20-year-old female who was perfectly normal weight before a car accident, afterwards she had a head injury and she started gaining excessive amounts of weight. And one of the physicians who was treating her, Dr. Robert Lustig, was able to give her a medication called octreotide that prevents the pancreas from releasing insulin, which actually was stimulating the hypothalamus, and it was causing her obesity. So it helped to dysregulate that cycle, and she quickly went on to lose weight after taking that medication. Here you can see some of the interactions, particularly with the fat tissue, the stomach. You have certain hormones that are being produced, particularly leptin. Insulin is produced by the pancreas, so that's an anabolic hormone. And we find that when there's too much insulin, it interferes with the signaling to the hypothalamus. So in a lot of cases, the hypothalamus doesn't recognize, for instance, leptin that is telling it that there's enough energy present. So when patients get type 2 diabetes, their insulin levels tend to go high for a certain period, and that can actually precipitate more weight gain. One, because insulin is an anabolic hormone, but two, those individuals tend to be hungry all the time. So when you look, this just shows again the hypothalamus and how you have certain hormones that are really affecting these different centers, either in the lateral part of the hypothalamus or the arcuate nucleus. You have ghrelin and leptin as well as others. I'm not going to get into all the specific effects because some of them we actually don't know that well. But it's a complex series of regulation between cells. Fat cells, you also have cells that are producing the insulin and the pancreas and the hypothalamus. So that the hypothalamus has a set point, and if you're losing weight, one of the features that we find is that the hypothalamus guards against loss of weight in many cases at all costs. So if you have a weight increase and you gain weight, it's actually difficult to lose that weight once the hypothalamus establishes a new set point. And you can see here, this shows the interference of insulin with leptin as far as the ventral medial hypothalamus being able to recognize that leptin, as well as in other regions, the nucleus accumbens as well. And you can see the interaction of all these different hormones, so that if, for instance, your brain is telling you that you need to gain weight, it may actually cause that individual to lower the physical activity. So it's a complex regulation between these hormones, how much physical activity you do, and how much fat is actually present within the body in the fat tissue. All right, so one of the ways that physicians and scientists measure the energy content of food is by looking at calories in the food. And how do you determine what exactly is a calorie? A calorie, by definition, is when you typically totally burn that food in a calorimeter. It's going to be the amount of energy released that raises the temperature of that water by 1 degree centigrade. And it's typically, I believe, like a kilogram or a liter of water. So energy, typically when we have energy being produced in the hypothalamus in the form of ATP, that energy conversion is not 100% efficient, so you get heat being produced as well as a byproduct, so that helps keep us homeothermic and maintaining our body temperature. But the ATP is used for transport work, mechanical work, chemical work, and as you see here, it's literally going to, you can determine how much your body is burning by measuring the oxygen that is being utilized relative to the CO2 being produced. So oxygen consumption is a typical way to measure what that individual's metabolic activity is. And when you look at the respiratory quotient is the ratio of pure CO2 produced to oxygen consumed. Remember, when you completely oxidize foods like fat, you're going to be liberating carbon dioxide as well as water, or the end products, and you're hopefully going to be forming a lot of ATP and have the heat being produced as well. And depending on what foodstuff you eat, whether it's carbohydrate, protein, or fat, the ratio of oxygen produced to CO2 consumed is going to be different. So that's known as the respiratory quotient. So when you look at the individual reactions that occur, like for carbohydrates, it's 1, where you get an equal amount of oxygen consumed to CO2 produced, whereas with fats, the respiratory quotient is approximately 0.7, as it is approximately 0.8 for protein. So that's where they derive those numbers from. So basal metabolic rate, they typically can do various different metabolic studies where they measure your oxygen consumption to determine what your metabolic rate is, and the modifying factors typically include those: the age, your gender, how much lean muscle mass you have, physical activity level, diet, as well as hormones. In fact, it literally takes more energy to digest proteins than it does to digest carbohydrate and fat. And that's what's known as the thermogenic effect of eating proteins. It actually, you have to put energy in to digest it, so the energy content of the protein is not going to be totally utilized by the body. So basal metabolism is things that you have to do all the time. For instance, you have sodium potassium ATPases being active, you have all sorts of transport, protein synthesis, different ATPases, gluconeogenesis, production of urea. And when you look at all this, you can see basal metabolic rate, which without any physical activity takes up a large proportion of the food that you eat. So it's the remaining 70, like 10% is oxygen consumed, is consumed for non-mitochondrial processes, 20% is consumed by the mitochondria to counteract proton leak within the mitochondria. You also have 70%, the remaining 70 is consumed by these processes. So when you look at it, the in should equal the out, so energy consumption, the food coming in should equal the expenditure going out, otherwise you're going to gain weight. If you have more food or energy content coming in, you're going to increase the mass of that individual. But it's more complex than that. It's not just the simple in versus out, because if your hypothalamus has a set point, it can literally, if that set point is telling you you need to gain weight, it will tell you to lower your activity. So you'll become more fatigued and tired. So it's a complex neuroendocrine regulation that is influenced by diet, but it's also influenced by exercise. You can force yourself to do exercise and become tired, but in some cases that actually makes you more hungry. So the hypothalamus is very good at trying to maintain that individual weight that you have as your set point. And we talked about before the problem with the visceral adiposity. That tends to lead to insulin resistance, particularly in the liver and the muscle. But unfortunately, the fat doesn't have the same problem with that insulin resistance. So the fat tissue will still be able to increase in size when you have increased amount of insulin being around. You also have the fat around the organs as well. So the metabolic conversion of nutrients, in general, nutrients in the body are interconvertible, like glucose can be converted to fat, but conversely, most of the energy in fat cannot be converted into glucose. Only a small percentage, maybe 2 or 3%. Because remember, fat has fatty acids which are broken down 2 carbon units at a time. And the only part of the fat that can be used for gluconeogenesis are either the glycerol, which is a 3 carbon unit that's found in the backbone of triglycerides, or if it's an odd chain fatty acid, that terminal 3 carbon unit after the breakdown of the 2 carbon